How are you?
Hello, how you doing, Senator?
Good. How's home?
Beautiful sunny day, New Mexico. I think
Unusually, it's actually
yeah.
nice here right now.
Oh, that's great. Well, it was nice and cloudy and cold a couple of days ago. So I'm hoping we have a stretch of sunshine here. So here we are.
I'm not sure. I hear there's a big winter storm coming that could end
Oh,
up getting boxed in over New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, somewhere in the Rockies, and
oh
just
no,
park for a while.
not again.
So I'll take it. Any amount of snow we can put in the mountains now makes life easier a few months from now.
Amen to that. Yeah. So okay. Well,
Well,
I'm here to help you out to do state historian work. So what do we want to talk about?
Well, I wanted to sort of pick your brain about the process that New Mexico went through to become a state. As I've learned more about that debate, I have to admit I learned a lot, and I've also maybe learned that things haven't changed as much as we like to think they've changed sometimes, especially around the debate around language, for example. So I just thought we'd have a conversation about some of the parallels and differences between what New Mexico went through over 100 years ago now, and what potentially Puerto Rico might go through in the coming decades.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds like a good topic. And there are really powerful parallels between New Mexico and Puerto Rico. I mean, uh, this wasn't our first rodeo. We had been part of a world empire when Spain was ruling what's now Mexico and the southwestern United States. And we were a provincia and a reino. Reino sounds very noble, like castles and kings, but it was just a political term of the day that meant a territory. And we were ruled from Mexico City. Governors were appointed. We didn't vote for governors. They were appointed from
Right.
Mexico City. And then we got our independence from Spain in 1821 and then became a territory of Mexico. And we had a similar situation. Mexico wanted to be like the United States and post-revolution France, but Mexico was building her new nation on ancient medieval institutions like absolute monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. So we were in a similar situation in that we had governors appointed again from Mexico City. And in between, local guys would be governor with names like Bartolome Baca or
Right.
Chavez and Manuel Armijo, who is 3 times a governor. This is where we get
Wow.
our politicos, our New Mexico politicians. This is where it really starts to take shape here in New Mexico. So you have that ebb and flow, that back and forth. But we had no real taste of democracy yet. So when there's a war between the United States and Mexico in 1846, the result is that we become part of the United States. Texas was also part of Mexico and had declared independence in 1836. And one of the weird things about that is Texas claimed New Mexico all the way to the Rio Grande. And it gets my blood boiling when I see those old maps. It's totally wrong, okay? That never happened. But
Yeah.
it's part of the story of how we become a territory. The United States annexed New Mexico, and that was Arizona at the same time. Arizona used to be part of New Mexico and California, and of course then annexed Texas in 1845. That leads to war. But I want to make a quick point about language. Spanish has been spoken in New Mexico since 1598.
Right.
It was spoken in Florida starting in 1565. Spanish is a language of North America. It's the first European language spoken in what is today the United States.
Right.
So I just want to make that point that it's not a new or foreign language in the United States. It's been here for centuries.
And yet it was a big part of the debate. And I don't want to, force you to skip forward all the way to the early 1900s from, what happened in 1848. But the differences between Arizona and New Mexico, and the issue of the Spanish language was really a giant part of the debate, as it is today with Puerto Rico, despite the fact that for over 100 years now, Puerto Rican Americans are American citizens.
Well, look, under Mexico at least ideally wanted public education in all of her states and territories. We were a territory.
Right.
People like Padre Martinez of Taos, he brought the first printing press here. He started a seminary for New Mexico for public education. The first newspapers published in New Mexico were in Spanish. But you're right, by 1848, after the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo makes us a part of the United States. But the question is, what do you do with us? Well, the Compromise of 1850 had a lot of politics involved. And the result was that California was brought in as a free state, Texas was a slave state, and the New Mexico Territory, which is what we were relegated to because of that compromise, we were given the choice and we were a free territory. Politics initially that were involved in our becoming a territory because of that power struggle going on between the North and the South, Republicans and Democrats, and jockeying for position. And there was a civil war on the horizon. But that is how we became a territory. And by 1850, we had enough people to be a state, but we had mainly Mexican people and Puebloan, New Mexican native peoples, and Apache and Navajo. And the people back east, they looked at us as foreign, as inferior, as mixed blood Catholics and savages who were unworthy of statehood. And this would be something that would stick with us. As you mentioned earlier, also the language issue, the fact that there was a lot of Spanish being spoken here between 1850 and getting into the 1890s. White Americans were a real minority here. They were coming on the Santa Fe Trail starting in 1821, and they had names like Bent and Carson, and all these different folks are showing up. But that's another difference you see between Texas, where there were a lot of Americans from the East and California as well, whereas New Mexico was essentially a Mexican population. And the documents and the newspapers are full of comments about how the people here speak the Mexican language, they're Mexican. And the leaders at the time, there was a general who came here in the 1860s, and he did not like it here. And he said, I don't know why any sane man would come to New Mexico. They need to get rid of their adobe buildings. They need to learn English. They need to get rid of their goats and their sheep. And he even said, half jokingly, we need to declare war on Mexico again and make Mexico take New Mexico back.
Wow.
So these are the attitudes that New Mexicans were dealing with. So you have that for about 30 years. And the U.S. government, I'd have to say, was a little bit negligent of New Mexico.
Sure.
There were no real attempts to establish public education here. Most of it was being done by the Catholic Church. You had nuns, the Sisters of Loreto, the Carmelitas, the Carmelites. Bishop LeMay had brought in nuns to educate and, in his view, re-Christianize the New Mexicans. But it's really
that language,
problematic.
I mean, the pushback from all of that was to actually enshrine Spanish in our education system, actually. And today we see that as a great benefit, but back
then it was not seen as a benefit. And it was also just it's part of what happens when you build an empire, when you expand your borders and you take over people who have different cultures and different languages. It's a different experience than immigrating to a country, where you immigrate and you say, I'm going to go to that place and learn their language and learn their culture and assimilate and become part of them. The Pueblo people knew all too well what it was like to have outsiders come in and force their
Right.
economic systems like the encomienda, which was a form of servitude, and Catholicism, trying to eradicate their religion and get rid of their culture. Well, they stood tough, and so much so that they had the first revolution in what's today the United States,
Right.
the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which was a fight for survival, cultural survival, if anything. Well, then we all got that experience in 1848, 1850, and it's never pleasant to be on the receiving end of colonialism, no matter who's doing it, whether it's Spanish, French, British, or American. So we were wrestling with this for about 30 or 40 years. And it's interesting because when you get into the 1890s, it's not like everyone was against statehood or everyone was for it. You obviously have factions, and a lot of times it was the wealthier classes that were against it because they had a pretty good deal going out in faraway New Mexico
without a whole lot of oversight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's a back and forth thing so you have your last real push of anti-statehood in the mid 1890s, but the tide starts to turn in the late 1890s and into the early 1900s. It's interesting when you look at what politicians were saying, what business people were saying, and what newspapers were saying at the time. They start to say that New Mexico is ready. There's critics. One guy comes out, a politician, and he says that he goes to Taos around 1893 and he attends an Indian festival, he calls it. That's what they called it back then. And that he said that the Mexican people here aren't even as intelligent as the Indians. They're backwards. They're uncivilized. And
I've seen some of that.
Yeah, and it was Catron who responded and said these folks are civilized. The native peoples of New Mexico, they speak Spanish. They are Roman Catholic, and they are integrated into the local culture. It's interesting that those negative things from 50 years before all of a sudden became positive things, to be Catholic and to speak Spanish. But it's these attitudes that really we start to overcome them. There is propaganda, and also important is around 1880, the U.S. establishes an immigration office in New Mexico to try to bring more Americans from the East, to try to make this place a little bit more palatable, because they realized they needed Americans here to make it a viable place for a state, at least in the eyes of some Easterners.
And there was an assumption that New Mexico would be perhaps in perpetuity a Republican leaning political state, right? So you had people like Matthew Quay from Pennsylvania, or even Teddy Roosevelt, supporting the cause of statehood. But obviously we've seen time and again, as states have joined the Union, how those things flip over time, whether it's New Mexico or Alaska or Hawaii. And I see that those assumptions really play into the Puerto Rico statehood argument all the time, even though they have a resident commissioner who's a Republican and a former resident commissioner and governor who's a Democrat.
Well, that's the thing, Senator, you know better than I, politics are complicated and they make for strange bedfellows at times. I mean, we were able to turn back the Texans in 1841 and show them that we were not Texan and we were not going to be a slave territory, but there were political implications then. And there were political implications in the early 1900s that come into play. And you see the comments that the tide starts to turn, where in the 1850s, 1860s, it was the fault of the New Mexicans that we weren't worthy of statehood. We were too Mexican, we were too Catholic, we spoke Spanish, or they would call it the Mexican language. There were uncivilized native peoples. Well, by the 1900s, there's arguments that blame the federal government, that say, why weren't we sending public educators to New Mexico in the 1850s, in the 1860s? These folks want to be a state. They want statehood. It's the federal government's fault for not helping them and showed themselves to be intelligent, to be hardworking, to be good Americans. So you have these hurdles that have to be overcome. And then, Senator, there's this idea that starts in the early 1900s that we're Spanish and not
Right.
Mexican. So this also is a way of making it more palatable to Easterners. Easterners were very suspicious of the West, and not just of the Mexican people, the Native Americans, but of white Americans who would go live in such a place.
In these places.
Yeah. So it was there was a movement amongst Nuevo Mexicanos and Eastern Americans that we weren't Mexican, we were Spanish and therefore more European, and it would be a lot easier to allow us to come in if we could be perceived as Spanish. So, you know, this is what happens. And there's this weird thing that happens in 1906 to make Arizona and New Mexico a joint state. And it goes back and forth. The New Mexicans are against it, then they're for it. The Arizonans are completely against it. It didn't happen, but I mean, between something like 1890 and 1906.
Just think Arizona would have had so much better food today if that had happened.
Oh my gosh, they would have had red and green chile. But there were like 20 attempts to get bills passed that failed, but ultimately we get there. So what's the parallel with Puerto Rico? Well, Puerto Rico, like New Mexico, already had a native population, the Taino people who'd been there for centuries. They had migrated from South America and the mainland, and they had populated many areas of the Caribbean. So they're already there. They're first, just like the Pueblo people are the first New Mexicans. Well, Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, on his second voyage in 1493, he goes to that island and names it San Juan, after San Juan Bautista, the St. John the Baptist. So the island was called San Juan, and the port was called Puerto Rico, rich port.
Rich port.
Well, over the decades, over time, they get switched, and the island starts to be called Puerto Rico, and the port is called San Juan.
The port is San Juan,
Yeah, so you have this similar culture. The Spaniards come, they impose encomienda on the native peoples. They bring diseases from Europe that the natives are not immune to, just like the people here were hit very hard, the natives, by disease brought by the Spanish in the 1500s and 1600s. In fact, there are epidemics and pandemics almost every 20 years or so, devastating. Well, this happens in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico becomes an amalgam of native peoples, the remnants of native peoples, African slaves brought to do work, and Spanish people from the Canary Islands and Andalusia, Spain, and they're mixing, just like in New Mexico, they're mixing. So by the time you get to the 1800s, Spain's power, which was great in the 1500s, has already kind of weakened by the 1800s. Spain loses a lot of her empire. I mean, Mexico becomes independent, we become independent. So she's left with her Caribbean holdings, the Philippines, Guam. And so she hangs on to this. Well, the United States, it's not lost on me that the United States' first international conflicts, besides trying to wrestle herself from England, were with Hispanic countries. Mexico first in 1846, and then Spain. And there's a similarity. United States, because of manifest destiny, kept moving west, and it was easy at first, right? France just sold Louisiana territory, no biggie. And then the United States asked Mexico politely, can we purchase the Southwest? And Mexico said, no gracias, no thank you. We like having our land base. So all of a sudden, President Polk creates a war that actually was Abraham Lincoln called him on it and said, you're basing this on a lie. I'd like you to show us exactly where American blood was spilled. And Ulysses S. Grant called it a very immoral war, but it was a land grab to move west, to rule from sea to shining sea. Well, in the 1890s, it had been studied that to be a world power, you have to have a strong navy, like England. England was the model later on. Spain had a powerful navy, but then England. So in around 1890, it was decided that it would be in the U.S.'s best interest to have some holdings in the Caribbean. So the U.S. approached Spain to sell Cuba and Puerto Rico. And Spain said, no gracias, no thank you. So all of a sudden, a few years later, because of this access to the Caribbean and then the desire to build a canal around Honduras or Panama, a war is declared when the USS Maine was supposedly attacked by Spain in the harbor of Havana. Well, historians have studied that, and many on both sides, the US and the Spanish side, have speculated that there was an accident on the US Maine, that the explosion was an accident, but it was used as an excuse to declare war on Spain. That war did not last too long, and the United States ended up inheriting Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines.
And this is where Teddy Roosevelt comes into the story as well.
Exactly. The Rough Riders and all this story, this part of our history. And Cuba, Spain will not cede Cuba to the United States, but gives up dominance in Cuba. So there's a shaky relationship there. Bottom line, though, is the United States took over people that were very different from them, once again, who spoke Spanish since 1493, and were a mixed blood, mixed culture people. And then in 1917, they're granted citizenship, but they're a territory, just like New Mexico had been. So they could go fight in World War I, but they did not have representation, full representation. And so
now we've had
situation.
100,000, Puerto Rican Americans who've served in the military who've never had a senator or a congressional delegation that can actually vote.
Well, look, I mean, they've made major contributions to our country, just like the New Mexicans. I mean, it's New Mexico that made it possible to have trade with California, and for the United States to have a land base that reached to the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, New Mexicans fought in the Civil War against the Confederates on the Union side. I have ancestors, relatives who did that. And I have relatives who've served in all the major conflicts, like we all do. Hispanics, New Mexicans served in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam.
Very high levels of volunteerism.
Yeah, my father, my late father, composed a corrido about Daniel Fernandez from Los Lunas, who died and fought and died in Vietnam. But it was an homage to all the Hispanic New Mexicans who have fought. And the Puerto Ricanos have that same history. And another point that's interesting, in the early 1900s, there was a move to change our name. I think they just thought it's too Mexican. New Mexico, they wanted to change it to Montezuma, as if that was less Mexican. I find that kind of humorous.
Some irony there.
Yeah, and then the United States changed Puerto Rico's name to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico for a while, but that didn't stick either, thankfully. I much prefer Puerto Rico, but you see these parallels, you see these attempts at statehood. And I find that this tradition we have of conquering, it's hard for me to talk about because I was conquered. It was my ancestors that were conquered. We were Mexicans and we were taken over. But it's the same thing, it's a strange thing to me to see our country take over Mexico, half of Mexico, and then take over Puerto Rico, and then have some sectors of our nation get upset when there's Spanish being spoken in the United States. Well, the United States became a very Mexican country in 1848, and then a very Caribbean nation in 1898. From 1848 to 1898, that 50-year span, we were already speaking Spanish in this country. And then we've added to that with defeating Spain in 1898. So you look at 1598 to 1898, we were colonized. New Mexico was colonized by Spain in 1598. And 300 years later, here we are we're part of the United States, which has always been a polyglot nation. It's
Right.
never been English only. The
Yeah.
13 colonies had English speakers, French speakers,
French.
German speakers, Native American speakers, Africans from the Caribbean, probably speaking some Spanish and some French. It's always had different languages. And then Louisiana came into play with French being spoken. And then, of course, Florida and the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Spanish has been spoken here for centuries. This is not new to our country. This is not foreign. This is American. This is the United States.
I think one of the nice things about the story of New Mexico's struggle to become a state is just how effectively New Mexicans have hung on to all of that complicated culture as an example, because I know there are some in Puerto Rico that are concerned about becoming Americanized, and what that means, lots of different things to different people. But when you look at New Mexico, you realize you really can hang on to your culture, your identity, your language, and still have representation.
Well, look, that's history, right? When you are taken over by another group of people, it changes you, but you also change them. But you just said the worries that some Puerto Ricanos have. I understand. Guess what? The Pueblo people had to deal with that when the Spanish came and took over. And then the Nuevo Mexicanos had to deal with that when the Americans took over, and the Pueblo people. But guess what? The Pueblo people are still here. They are vibrant as ever. They have their languages. They have their cultural traditions. Sure, they've been impacted by Spanish and Mexican and American rule, but they're still here. And the same thing with the Nuevo Mexicanos. We're still here. We have our roots in Mexico, our roots in Spain, but we also have our Native American roots and African roots too. African history in New Mexico started in 1539 with Esteban. He was from North Africa. He was the first official representative of Spain to the natives of New Mexico at Zuni. And so it's been international since 1539. And I think it only enriches us. We're not going to stay in the past.
I like to point out to my colleagues from New England some of that history and the breadth and length of that history when you compare it to the colonial history that they know so well in the Northeast.
Well, my American cousins actually love going to DC, and I love going to Georgetown and old parts of New York City. I love seeing the colonial homes. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful history. But expanding our horizons and embracing New Mexico history, that just enriches the United States. Esteban's story in 1539 isn't just New Mexico history. It's United States of America history. And Puerto Rico history with Columbus there, Cristobal Colon in 1493, that just expands American history. It doesn't take away from it. It adds to it. And I think we need to just rethink how we look at ourselves and our history. I'm the state historian of New Mexico, and I'm very blessed. We have an amazing history here, but I want people to not look at our history as just old things that happened 500 years ago. They're happening to us now. Puerto Rico has a chance, and so does the United States has a chance now to make history. We're making history with this pandemic. We're making history with how we look at ourselves and each other, how we look at monuments and statues in our country and in our state, and ask ourselves, what does this tell us? And what does this tell my fellow citizens? I'm not just in this by myself. And I'm not a person who lives in 1598 or 1693. You don't want that. You're a museum piece if you do that. You want to be a living, vibrant person. And a lot has happened in New Mexico since 1598, and a lot has happened in our country since 1776.
Rob, I hate to cut this off because it's so much fun and I'm learning a lot as well. But I have to go make history and vote for the first Native American Secretary of Interior from the state of New Mexico.
Amen.
And give a speech on the floor. But I really appreciate your time here today. This has been fantastic.
It's been an honor. Thank you. And thank you for your service to New Mexico and the United States. And I think it's a great thing to be advocating for at this point in time. And we'll do this again sometime.
Oh, I look forward to it.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.